Okay, so the first thing I would like to do is welcome everyone. Thank you for attending. This particular session is going to focus on marijuana rescheduling. I don't know how many of you have heard or if you remember back in December 2025, President Trump issued an executive order to expedite the reclassification or rescheduling, it's kind of used interchangeably, of marijuana. Now, on the surface, I think a lot of people didn't think about that, but it is a really big deal. So we're kind of, in a way, sounding a little bit of an alarm, but we do want you guys to make your voices heard. Education is key. You need to learn facts, myths, and realities on this topic. So we're here to help. We're here to answer questions. This is your session, not ours. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Kim Clater. I'm with FleetSafe Solutions out of Midlothian, Virginia. We're a full-service compliance organization. We also are a full-service consortium third-party administrator. I've been in this industry a long time. I've seen a lot of changes with drug testing, and I have to say this is probably one of the most disturbing I think I have ever seen. And again, we will get into this. And I would like to introduce Patrice was been with me. Joe McGuire. Joe is the executive director of NDASA. That's the National Association Drug and Alcohol Screening. She's been there a long time. My goodness, I can't even think what Joe has stored in that brain. She's just got a lot of info to share with us. And she was kind enough to join us. She's been traveling internationally, nationally, so she's a treat to have. And then we have Juan Moya. He is kind enough to join us. Juan was a former FMCSA drug and alcohol program manager out of Washington, D.C. So he was very instrumental in contributing to the development of the clearinghouse, as well as some other issues. Now, Patrice, who hopefully will be up here corralling more people for us, Patrice Kelly, she's joining us.
Thanks for coming.
Yes, she was the former former director of the Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy Compliance, ODAPC, that's what we reference in this industry. Part 40. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Part 40. That is the subpart that it addresses collectors, it addresses laboratories, BATs, SAPs, MROs, but really important, it talks about procedures, processes. It's really the foundation for drug and alcohol testing programs. So we are going to address several different pieces today. We're going to go over impairment, we're going to go over the classification, and then Juan, being FMCSA guru, will talk about the impact on trucking. So all of that being said, let's get started. Okay, now, this, and I'm going to let the panel speak to this a little bit. There was an incident that happened January 4th, 1987. This was the catalyst for all of our DOT drug testing. So if we could play the video very briefly, that would be fantastic. Okay, we're good. Kind of gives you an idea of what really started this. Now, I'm going to let our panelists and they can take turns, really speak to what happened here. A lot of people I talk with over the years, they think that amphetamines was the catalyst for drug testing. It was not. It was this accident. And we do find that a lot of people in the industry, they don't really understand what happened here and what this meant. So I will let Joe go first, and then Patrice and Juan can add to that.
Thank you, Kim. The U.S. Chase Conrail's train crash, which is how it's referred to, was the deadliest rail crash in the U.S. At the time that the incident occurred, and it followed incidents that some of y'all will remember. Some of you will say, you know, that was before my time, but we had the Exxon Valdez, we had the USS Nimitz disaster, we had the New York subway crash. We had all of these incidents, but the culmination of, and every one of these things, then there were more, were drug and alcohol related incidents by the operator. This particular case, the pilot of a train running light, an Amtrak train running light, chose to smoke marijuana at the railway depot with his brakeman and several other operators as well. Got into the engine of this train, barreled down the tracks, missed multiple signals. I mean, close to 24 signals to stop, go in another direction, change tracks, all kinds of signals, because they were under the influence, you know, flying high. And they intersected with a passenger train where hundreds of families had just boarded to come home from Christmas break. And some were commuters that worked in the city and were going home. And they intersected with that passenger train, killed the engineer of that train, 16 others. Many were injured and still suffer with those injuries today. So it was that incident where it's not that we didn't have any drug testing happening before this, but what was happening was all of the different modes of transportation were kind of out there trying to do their own thing, getting protections. The unions were fighting them. All kinds of they were getting beat up. And finally, after this incident, President Reagan stepped in with an executive order and said, enough is enough. The federal testing program is going to be mandatory. Lots of other administrative things happen there, of course, but this incident is like what we look back to as a linchpin. And the big point I want to make to you is that it all came down to smoking pot, right? And now here we are, what is it, 40 years later or whatever, and here we are just saying, we're going to go to Schedule 3, and we don't, right now, currently, as we all sit here today, we don't have any protections for our DOT drug testing program. And that's an item of concern that we're going to be addressing. Do you guys want to add to that?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. And so with the Chase, Maryland accident, my background, as Kim mentioned, is with the U.S. Department of Transportation. So I started there in 1991. And I was involved with a lot of the early drug and alcohol stuff because this accident caused us as a nation to gasp. To say, wait a minute, can commercial operators use drugs? Is that okay? And what happened was the Department of Transportation drafted their regulations, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But importantly, Congress got involved. Congress said, how could this have happened? Why was there no opportunity for deterrence? Why did this have to result in these fatalities of our people? And from that came additional legislation that helped to bring us where we are today, but the DOT regs were in place after this crash. After this crash, this happened in January of '87. The Secretary of Transportation said to the Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Federal Transit, that was UMTA at that time, Federal Railroads, Pipelines and Hazardous Materials, which was RISPA at that time, and the United States Coast Guard, which was part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. You guys are all going to go sit in separate rooms and come up with your own regulations so that this never happens again. So those were the marching orders. They came out with some pretty remarkable stuff. when you consider they didn't have a basis for starting this. I mean, the Department of Defense, of course, had been testing the military since the 70s, but DOT created their own programs to try to address the situation. There were more than 600 people on the train that day, and look at the date. It was the holidays. A whole lot of college students, a whole lot of people whose lives were changed forever. And I like to tell the story when I'm out at conferences because I think it really drives it home and makes it real. One of my neighbors, I was talking about what I do and how important it is to not let marijuana drop out of the testing panel. And I started talking about Chase, Maryland, and she went dead white. And she said, Patrice, I was on that train. I was a college student. I was on that train and I climbed over bodies. And if you look at the footage, the film footage that we just saw, it had just come from water. And so if that collision had happened over the water, we wouldn't have had many survivors at all. That was purely an act of grace that happened on the land. So again, this caused us as a nation to gasp and say, we put an awful lot of people's lives into the trust of commercial operators. We need to make sure that we deter this kind of thing from ever happening again. And I'll touch on it more later, but not so much Chase, Maryland, but kind of talk to you a little bit more about what's happened and where we're going. But in the meantime, Juan, do you have anything you want to add?
I want to add, that the cause is you had the conductor of the train under the influence of marijuana, right? I want to bring another accident, and that was the precursor for the clearinghouse. It was New Orleans, a bus driver crashed and killed 22 people, right? And that was on 1999. And after an investigation from the National Transportation Safety Board made a recommendation for the clearinghouse. So it took that long. He was under the influence marijuana too. So we here with these regulations because mostly marijuana accidents, right? And now we're trying to remove the marijuana from their schedule. So that's to think about that.
Okay, very good. Thank you, all three. So we're going to go ahead and move on to marijuana impairment. And this is going to seg into the regulation. And then, of course, Juan will talk about the impact, what this would mean for the transportation industry. So Joe, it will address these particular points and questions. So the first one is no employer is required by any state to allow employees to operate while impaired. So Joe, for you, can you address the state laws and the differences between state and federal that prohibit impairment in the workplace? Because there's a lot of confusion about that.
There is a lot of confusion. First and foremost, I think it's important for everyone in the room to understand that DOT 49 Part 40 and the drug test laws that govern FMCSA are preeminent over any state law. So it doesn't matter what the state laws say, your federal drug testing program overrules it, period. We get a lot of people that are confused about that, and they try to say, well, my state just did this or this or this, so that impacts my DOT testing program. And for some of you, I know you're sitting there going, there's no way anybody thinks that. Yes, they do. So if you're one of them, I understand why there is confusion, because those state laws can seem very intimidating or whatever, but your DOT drug testing program stands regardless. And the DOT has issued statements in the past that say, we have the marijuana statement and the medical marijuana statement that you can find on the ODAPSI website. So your DOT testing program is preeminent. That having been said, no state law for your non-DOT programs, no state law precludes you from testing for marijuana. There are some limitations, okay? But you do not have to allow anyone to use at work, use while operating, be under the influence while operating. Every single state has provisions that protect you from that. Now, some states have restricted things like pre-employment testing for your non-DOT people. But look at your state law. If you need help with some good attorneys who are specialized in that area, we can help you. Because if you're safety sensitive, most states protect your safety sensitive operators, which would include your truck drivers. And that's, up to 10,001 or 10,001 to 26,000, whatever you have. So we want to make sure that you understand that you're not beholden to those things in most cases where you have your safety sensitive. Even on your pre-employment, no state has restricted post-accident testing, reasonable suspicion testing. And when we talk about impairment, all right, FMCSA says to you that every one of your supervisors should be trained on the signs and symptoms of people operating under the influence of drugs and alcohol. That must happen. This is a day and age where, because these things are so confusing and convoluted, but because drug use is being normalized, that's the key right there. Because drug use is being normalized in our society, every supervisor needs to be able to eyeball any driver on the line, or any employee for that matter, and understand, are their eyes dilated? Are they slurring their speech? Are they, if we change the environment, we walk down the hall, go into a different environment, are they struggling? What does this look like? So that we are doing and conducting our reasonable suspicion testing. That is the most underutilized tool we have in our tool belt, and the most effective tool for detecting impairment that we've got. Impairment testing through a cup. You're never going to detect someone's impairment in a urine cup, right? It's not going to happen. Oral fluid can tell you recent use, but it's not going to tell you if they're impaired. Right. We don't even have a definition of impairment that is legal that holds up in court right now. So we've got to stop looking for the next big thing when it comes to what is the test that detects impairment. There's some cool tools out there. There's some cool stuff happening, some eye goggles, some things that we like, but they don't have evidentiary history behind them yet. So we're looking at them, we love them, but at the end of the day, the eyeballs and the training and the eyeballs on the people, the documentation and the reasonable suspicion test, that's the most effective tool you have. And let me also say this, the US Supreme Court has upheld reasonable suspicion testing in the workplace for decades, repeatedly. So this is not something you have to be afraid of, worry about liability, we have a person in our industry who says all the time, who was instrumental in the big landmark case at US Supreme Court, all you need is something more than a hunch to conduct the test, and you don't have to be right. Right? Your job is to protect safety. So we really want to make sure you understand that even removing marijuana from the drug test panels, which we're hearing a lot of people are doing, that puts all the liability and culpability on you as the employer for accepting the financial burden and the responsibility of whatever someone chooses to do while operating under the influence. Bad idea. Don't do it, don't be intimidated, and I'm here to tell you if you need help with that, please reach out, because we can give you the confidence you need to make sure that safety comes first over an individual's right to use drugs and be impaired. That's
Thank you, Joe. That is great. And I would ask one more question. One of the points is, do federal laws supersede state laws with regard to the workplace? Now, I think most know that when it comes to DOT, it does not. So the question is that we get often, do federal laws supersede state laws with regard to non-DOT testing in the workplace?
Right, and so that was really my point. Your DOT drug testing program does supersede those changing state laws with marijuana. However, we're talking about Schedule 3, so we have an executive order to move marijuana to Schedule 3. In our DOT drug testing program, right now, we're only allowed to test for Schedule 1 and 2, and I don't want to step on the other speaker's portion. So that's a federal decision that's going to have a direct impact unless we get a safety carve-out, which is something that we're working on. But that hasn't happened, like Schedule 2 hasn't happened yet. I mean, Schedule 3 hasn't happened yet with marijuana, right? The president signed the order, but that didn't move it to Schedule 3. There's a big administrative process that has to happen first. It could take years. So we were told, no, he wants it done in months. Well, we're almost 4 months out, well, 3 months out, I guess, to the day almost. So He cannot just overrule the DEA process, the FDA involvement. There's all this administrative work that has to be done on the background that we don't even know if it's feasible or possible for that executive order to go into place. Attorneys are going to get involved, lawsuits are going to happen. None of this is happening overnight. So right now, your federal drug testing program stands as it is, and yes, federal supersedes state, and that's where it will stand for now. So we can get into the rest of it in a minute.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. We will now move to the nuts and bolts of the rescheduling of marijuana, and our expert, our queen of regulations, Patrice Kelly, who again, she was very instrumental in crafting Part 40. She's extremely knowledgeable of this topic, and I'm going to let her speak to, okay, what would this mean? And as Joe said, nothing has happened yet, but what would this mean?
Thanks, Kim. So first of all, I'm not really the queen of regulations. I'm kind of the big sister of Part 40. I didn't start it. But also importantly, when I was working on the regulations, I'll just add what each person who filed public comments had to say mattered. You know, I don't know if you were here for the FMCSA session that preceded us, but when the administrator said, we're going to be listening to you, we already were doing that. We were already trying to find out what were the most cost-effective and efficient ways. So rulemaking, if the government's doing it right, rulemaking is supposed to be asking you for your thoughts and then doing things that make sense. They might not agree with you on everything, but at least they're trying to hear you and come out with something that makes sense. So let's go back to the 1980s and Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. We remember that. Drug use was a huge problem that President Reagan recognized. And he said, hey, look, the federal workforce is slowed down by it. High absenteeism. A lot of other factors that he wanted to address through drug testing, because he said drug testing would make a healthier, a more reliable workforce. It would be more cost effective. And again, by reducing absenteeism, by making people more reliable so you could count on them. So President Reagan issued an executive order where he said civilian federal employees will be subject to testing. He appointed the Department of Health and Human Services, through his executive order, to conduct the testing, to make the actual rules. Now, they are not regulations because they applied to federal employees. They were simply within governmental rules. But President Reagan granted the Department of Health and Human Services the authority to test for Schedule 1 and 2. Because I think, honestly, that's all they were concerned about at that point. Cocaine, marijuana, PCP, opioids, opiates at the time, amphetamines, all that. Yeah, they were concerned about that. And those are Schedule 1 and 2. So they thought that this made a lot of sense to approach it this way. Well, there's a little step in between that I mentioned before where DOT, everybody got locked in their own respective rooms in each of the modes, and they had to come out with their regulations. DOT was able to pull that authority to drug test from their general safety authority. So motor carriers, which was federal highways at that point, they were all one program, they said, we have authority over the roads. We can regulate this for the sake of safety. So they came up with these regulations, and so did all the other modes. Importantly, in 1991, remember I mentioned Congress got involved because of Chase, Maryland? Congress said, oh, DOT, don't look at your general safety authority anymore. We are specifically giving you this authority, and we're tying you to HHS. That's the problem. HHS is limited by President Reagan's executive order, and then Congress tied DOT to them. So this ability over here to just use DOT's safety authority went out the window. Now DOT is bound to Schedule 1 and 2. When President Biden proposed rescheduling marijuana to Schedule 3, his White House did not know that. They didn't recognize, actually they didn't realize at all, that this would have a direct impact on truck drivers, school bus drivers, airline pilots, air traffic controllers. They didn't realize that those folks would no longer be subject to the deterrent effect of marijuana testing. So then President Trump came along and he issued the executive order, again, not realizing the repercussions for rescheduling to Schedule 3. And it is not going to require rulemaking to take this away from us. Because, again, and this is just lowest common denominator for all of us, Schedule 1 and 2 is all DOT can do, because Congress stuck them with HHS. So once it's Schedule 3, there are no more certified labs, because HHS can't certify them. So bringing it all together, the executive order, as Joe said, says President Trump wants the administration to move forward with rulemaking on this subject. Nothing has changed yet. Federally required testing is going to end unless there's a safety carve-out. And the non-DOT workforce will be impacted because more than 20 states require companies to follow the DOT for their drug testing regulations for their company policies. So you need to get a DOT-like policy. And I think, we keep talking about the safety carve-out, and forgive me, so for those of you who are here, I really appreciate your being here because Secretary Duffy was making an appearance and then he was doing photos and everything else. So I was trying to bring more people in so we could all talk about this and have a conversation. So forgive me if you already covered exactly what the safety carve-out is.
No, we didn't.
Okay. The safety carve-out is merely the status quo. The safety carve-out will say the Department of Health and Human Services will continue to conduct testing for marijuana regardless of what it's scheduled to be. And then it will say DOT will continue its regulations requiring the testing for and the deterrence for marijuana. It will continue the air traffic controllers, the Secret Service, the FBI, truck drivers, airline pilots, and all the other modes. It will just continue exactly where we are today. But we've shown you the Chase, Maryland accident. Juan talked about the bus crash in Louisiana that brought us the clearinghouse. We've talked about other things. Joe mentioned many other things too. These accidents are all preventable when deterrence is in place. And we haven't had anything, thank goodness, the size of Chase, Maryland, since DOT put those regs in place. But once the bottom falls out on marijuana testing, we are genuinely concerned that we're going to have these problems all over again. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Does anyone have questions at this point for Joe or Patrice? I know it's a little regulatory in nature, but we, on a regular basis, all of us are receiving so many questions from clients. Any questions so far? This is your session. Don't be afraid to ask, and there is nothing that we consider dumb. I hear that a lot of times. We want to help. We want to answer your questions. Yes.
Thank you. Will companies still be allowed to do their own non-DOT drug testing after this goes through, or if it goes through?
Yes, non-DOT testing will, in my opinion, if we don't have the safety car, okay, let's go back. If we get to Schedule 3 and if we don't have the safety carve-out, then I think the non-DOT testing is kind of the savior of the safety program, in my estimation. So yes, absolutely, and that's a really good question. And so my encouragement to companies is, should we start seeing this, all these pieces come into play, that you need to review your non-DOT policy and make sure that it's a catch-all, that you haven't eliminated that THC testing and that you have all the reasons listed out and that type of thing. Would you
Although
agree?
I would add that for those 20 states where they tell you you need to follow what DOT requires in your company program, that may be problematic. And that'll also depend on, is marijuana legal in your state? If the state otherwise has a firm position about it, that's a different issue. But if they're saying you need to match DOT and make a DOT-like program, and DOT cannot test for marijuana, it could impact. I would talk to your local council if it gets to that point, because they will know. But that's one of our fears, is that this is going to impact the non-DOT marketplace because so many folks are already required by their state to follow DOT. So in other words, DOT's cutoffs are something that a lot of folks must follow. And if there's no cutoff because there's no marijuana, that leaves you in an awkward situation. That's one of my worries. Great question.
It's a good question. Any other questions at this point?
And Juan's focus is going to be specifically on how this is impacting the motor carrier industry and drivers and what have you.
Okay. And the one point that I do want, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's still a question I just wanted to kind of
didn't
segue
see-
while she
yes,
was running the mic.
yes.
I'm sorry. So if marijuana is moved to a Schedule C, could we as a company, either non-DOT or DOT, still voluntarily test for it? Or do
So-
we have to follow the DOT guidelines on what is tested exactly?
So, as Patrice just mentioned, some of that will depend on what your state law dictates. There are several states that say you must follow, like non-DOT must follow DOT policies. However, I would go to state policymakers and say, we need to take a look at this because we want to continue testing.
Right.
Because there may be exemptions for safety sensitive under your state laws. But at the end of the day, your non-DOT policy should be able to capture that test for THC where if the DOT is not protected under Schedule 3. So you'll be subject to your state laws. But again, I think that in most cases here in this room, we're talking about safety sensitive employers and employees, so we can take a look at that. And we have some wonderful attorneys in our industry. So let me explain the difference between my attorney and your attorney. Because this gets confusing. So I'm sure most of you have an employment attorney that looks at your policies and says yes, no, whatever. Not all attorneys are created equal, and even really good employment attorneys often have no clue about drug testing. They do a quick read through, and often they are misinformed and they advise you incorrectly. In the drug and alcohol testing industry and in our membership association, we have several attorneys that this has been their life work. They have followed every court case that has to do with drug testing in the history of the program. And so they will often say, we'll review and we will let your attorney know where they're off base to make sure that you're fully protected. And I will tell you it is worth the investment, and it's not a crazy cost, but it's worth the investment of, I don't want to start naming dollars, but to have that assurance that your safety program is intact. So make sure that a drug and alcohol expert reviews that policy. One of our industry experts knows every state law intimately, and we actually have several that do, but they're just fabulous with helping you navigate those state laws. Because I will promise you there are some states like New York that the press has come out and everything you can find on Google says you cannot test here, and it is not true. It's not true. So you have to connect with someone who can get you into those legalese details. Does that help you? Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so I do want, Joe, I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the impact on hair testing, oral fluid testing. I know it was referenced a little earlier. Tell us about hair testing. That's been bantered around in DOT for a while, so let's talk about that.
Before we get too deep into that, we have 5 minutes left in the session.
Oh, we better go then.
So I was going to say, I know we're teasing you with this, right? You can also come by our booth and ask
Yes,
about this.
just come by. We'll talk to you about hair testing.
But I was going to say, just in the interest of time, maybe just to,
I'm glad you mentioned
Juan's
that. Okay.
topic.
There's a lot to unpack with this, as you can see. Okay, so Juan, you are up next. So
All right.
Juan is our FMCSA expert, and he is going to talk about the potential impact on the trucking industry if this does go through. So Juan, you've got the floor.
Yes, and the first point about testing marijuana for prevention, a good drug and alcohol program is a deterrent from people using drugs, right? And I draw some data from the clearinghouse, and actually it's almost 33,000 people tested positive for marijuana in 2025.
Wow.
Right, reported in the clearinghouse. And that's around 60% compared to the other drugs. So that's a big chunk of positive testing reporting to the clearinghouse. So that's what is important, right? People is using it and they getting tested, and a lot of reports, the positive reports on that. Now, and the clearinghouse doesn't show what percentage belongs to post-accidents, right? Because people's interested in, okay, how that affect post-accidents, right? But it's another piece of data that is publicly available on the ODAPSI website. That's the MIS information, Management Information System. And it's what you report every year at the end of starting the following year, do your testing results, right? And this data for FMCSA is representative because not every carrier gets to report, right? It's kind of representative, but you can see they report like from the drug positives on post-accident, it was more than 50% reported. So that's a big chunk too of people getting positives for marijuana and post-accident. Now, keep in mind, for FMCSA, an accident is a fatality, or somebody has to be taken away from the scene, the vehicle has to be taken away from the scene, and a citation, right? And in those situations, except for fatality, but if you don't have a citation within 32 hours, that probably happens a lot of times, you don't get to test the person. So we're missing a big part of people, right, from the testing. So that just keep that in mind. So, and I know we're talking about the safety carve-out, drug testing. I know this follows with other part of the regulations, medical qualifications. Who's familiar with medical qualifications, right? It doesn't only apply to CDL drivers, it applies to non-CDL and interstate commerce, right? Part of that prohibits the use of substances, right? And if it's other non-schedule, in that case, marijuana will fall with that non-schedule 1. So it will need a medical evaluation. So doctors, medical practitioners, the way it's defined in the regulations, need to make an assessment on how the person is going to perform while using marijuana, right? So that's kind of difficult because we all know, and I know Patrice and Joe are very good experts on that, but it's very difficult to determine the level of impairment with marijuana, right? And actually, it's no test to identify you impaired for marijuana,
Yep.
right? And so that's the critical part. And it's another part of the regulations too, Part 392, when drivers are driving on the road. It's also in 392.4 prohibits people to having substance that might cause impairment. So how the roadside inspectors, police officers gonna document that, right? It's kind of difficult. So, and just imagine how difficult it would be measuring impairment on the roadside with people using marijuana. And we were talking to a gentleman yesterday. He said that he used to work on the ports of California. And he said, he was like, a lot of people was smoking and drugs around the port, right? Marijuana, because it's legal in California. So people is getting used to it, seeing it as a new normal. So, but it's affecting the safety, right? And affecting the safety, is how your insurance premiums could affect that. Because, you have a company, when you get your insurance, the insurance company is going to look into your CSA scores, right? And they ask you questions. Sometimes they give you discounts because you had a proactive program, EIP program or eliminated. But they also look into your basics, right? And if they see something there, it's going to affect you. I don't know what's going to happen, right? If they're going to safety carve out, how the insurance company is going to take that, because it's a risk. Regardless, it's a risk.
Right. If there's no safety carve out, I would think insurance companies would really take a serious look at that, because the accident rates in the states that have legalized marijuana, just the general commercial, the general passenger vehicle data is high. So commercial accidents are going to happen if there's not a safety carve out.
Okay, we're out of time. We are all at booth 40477. If you want to come and visit us with more questions, you want to talk to us about your company, how we can help you or answer questions. Again, we're here to educate. We're here to give you information that you need, because it's just not out there a great deal. All we're hearing is about the EO. We're not hearing about the implications of that.
Do we have time for another question? We can take a question if you want to stay for a minute.
Yeah, it's up to you guys. We're here.
Yeah.
Is it all right if we stay
it's
and
up
take a
to
couple of
the-
questions?
yeah.
I'm asking our sound people. Is that all
Yeah.
right? Okay. Yes.
Okay, as an owner-operator for 14 years and a member of ADA, the African American Women's Trucking Association, through our Driven Together education program, what should I be as an instructor giving, what type of information should I be putting out prior to this rescheduling happening? Is there anything like we can get a hold of now that I should be informing future drivers and drivers that are already in our program?
Yes, reach out to Endesa. I'll give you my contact information, but the bottom line right now is nothing has changed. You must be in your random poll, you must continue to test. Right now, nothing has changed. If we get a change, then that's a whole other layer of education that is going to have to be provided on the who, how, what, where, when. But for owner-operators right now, in all sectors, nothing has changed. And that really is the big news, because a lot of people think, oh, all of a sudden we don't have to test for it anymore and we can use. So I'm happy to help you out with that.
And I'll just add two things.
Great question.
Endesa's marijuana rescheduling one-page information sheet that's really helpful. That is at the booth where we are, and we're right by
up from-
OWIDA and Women in Trucking, and right behind FMCSA. So we're down here to the left. But Endesa has some great materials. And also, I'll just say, when I left the government last year after 35 years of federal service, one of the first things I did was join Endesa, because they keep you up to speed. But even if you don't want to join, for free, every Wednesday, they do drug and alcohol town hall, where you can get information for free from other industry professionals. You can ask your tough questions. And, please come see us at the booth if you'd like more information about town hall, or take Joe's business card, or I'll even offer mine, because I love connecting people, because we're in this together. And thank you for your service, because you keep these roads safe. Everybody in this room, you care and you matter, because you are keeping it safe. And this nation counts on you for supply issues, for safety, for everything that you do right now. Mm-hmm. And sincerely, coming from 34 years at DOT, I never could have done things as well and as safely without each person in this room and so many others like you implementing things the right way. So thank you.
Absolutely. More questions at this point? Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you.